There's a strange comfort that comes from finally hearing your side of things said back to you clearly. Ain't nobody arguing with you. You're not being corrected. You're just feeling understood. We've become a society looking for the person who looks at us and tells us we make sense. It's the feeling of having your reactions placed inside language that makes them feel reasonable. Like there's now a sentence for why you pulled back, a phrase for why you didn't try again, a framework that explains why the pressure disappeared the moment you understood yourself better. That relief is real. You feel it in your body before you think it through. The low-grade tension you've been carrying, waiting to be misunderstood, like it's inevitable, finally shuts off. I think people chase that feeling because the world already feels demanding enough, because being questioned everywhere is exhausting, and having to defend yourself all the time wears you down. So when you find a place, online or offline, where your inner story finally feels coherent, or where your reactions make sense without resistance, it can feel like you finally exhaled. The problem isn't that people want to feel understood. That's always been true. The difference is how easy it's become to make any version of yourself feel justified. We live in a moment where language is everywhere, where there's a word for every emotional state, a label for every response, an explanation for every hesitation. You don't just feel something anymore. You can explain why you feel it and why that feeling is valid and why anyone who questions it might be missing context. Almost any decision can now be framed as self-respect, any withdrawal as protection, any lack of movement as healing. And if you're articulate enough, or reflective enough, or simply consistent enough inside a particular narrative, that framing holds up surprisingly well, especially when you stay inside environments designed to reinforce it. I didn't notice this first as a critique of other people, I just noticed it in myself. Moments where I could tell a clean story about my behavior, feel the explanation land, and then notice something else happening quietly underneath. The urgency had dissipated. Not because the story was wrong, but because it was complete. Once the explanation settled in, the discomfort lost its edge, and without that edge, nothing moved. There's something seductive about being able to locate every struggle inside of context. Context removes shame, but it also removes pressure. When every reaction can be traced back to a reason, the question of what you do next becomes less urgent. You don't feel wrong anymore, and when nothing feels wrong, change starts to feel optional. That's where empowerment begins to shift into something else. No arrogance, no denial. At its best, empowerment is supposed to return agency to you. It reminds you that you're not powerless, that you can act, that you can choose differently. But when empowerment becomes indistinguishable from validation, it stops pointing forward and it starts looping. You become very good at inhabiting versions of yourself that function well in one context and collapse in another. You learn how to speak fluently about your inner life, but only in rooms where that language is rewarded. You're capable, but narrowly so. And because those environments feel safe, you stay there longer than you realize. What makes this tricky is that none of it looks broken from the outside. You sound thoughtful, you sound emotionally intelligent, you sound self-aware. You can explain yourself clearly. You just aren't changing. An explanation feels close enough to progress that it's easy to confuse the two. You see this pattern everywhere once you notice it. In relationships where both people are excellent at articulating their needs, but nothing actually changes. In creative lives where someone understands their blocks perfectly yet hasn't moved past them in years. In self-reflection that keeps getting more sophisticated while behavior stays the same. The story evolves, the self doesn't. It doesn't always have to be that people lack discipline or accountability. Accountability feels heavier once misunderstanding is gone. When no one is misreading you anymore, there's no villain left to blame. No missing information, no external friction to hide behind. Just you and the quiet awareness that something still isn't improving. That's when the justification becomes comforting. In a subtle way. It smooths things over before the friction has a chance to teach you anything. And the more fluent you become in that smoothing, the easier it is to mistake comfort for stability. The past didn't necessarily handle this better, they just handled it differently. There were fewer places to retreat into set language, fewer environments designed to fully adapt to your inner logic, more situations where you had to adjust because the context wasn't going to. That didn't make the world kinder, but it did apply pressure. And pressure, for all its dangers, is also what shapes things. What's striking now is how many of our systems are built to remove that pressure entirely. Efficiently. You interact with tools that reflect your thoughts back to you. You receive explanations faster than life gives you feedback. You refine your narrative long before reality has time to respond, and over time, you may start preferring those environments to the ones that add something of you, because being challenged after being understood feels harsher than being challenged in ignorance ever did. There's a particular discomfort in realizing no one is misreading you anymore and you still don't like where you are. That's when being right stops helping. That's when the story no longer moves you forward. We've gotten very good at bypassing the phase where things are unresolved, the phase where you don't have the right language, where you're clumsy, where you feel unfinished in public. That phase is uncomfortable, but it's where growth happens, like where growth actually happens. And it doesn't have to be through punishment or shame, but through repeated contact with resistance. Resistance that doesn't argue with you, it just doesn't move. What worries me isn't that people are being validated, because validation is necessary. What worries me is that validation has become the endpoint instead of an entry point. Because everyone around us is doing the same thing, the lack of movement starts to feel normal. Like this is what adulthood looks like now. Calmer, more articulate. We know everything, so we can label everything. And now everything has an excuse. There's a kind of aliveness that comes from being wrong somewhere, from bumping into limits you didn't anticipate, from realizing your explanation, however elegant, doesn't change the outcome. That aliveness is uncomfortable. It's the feeling of not having the right words yet, of knowing something needs to shift before you can justify it cleanly. We've gotten very good at avoiding that feeling. And I don't say that as an observer. I say it as someone who's felt the pull of staying inside that explanation longer than necessary, who's mistaken insight for a movement and confused being understood with being changed. The hardest moments aren't the ones where someone challenges you unfairly. Who challenges you at all? Where the responsibility doesn't disappear. It just becomes quieter. There's no growth without friction, and friction requires a context that doesn't fully accommodate you. It's a resistance that a world that always agrees with your perspective eventually stops developing you. The question isn't whether empowerment or validation are wrong. They aren't. The question is whether we still know how to leave them, whether we can step out of the spaces where we're always right and enter ones where we might be awkward again, where our explanations run out before the work does, where language stops protecting us, because that's where something actually changes. And I'm not sure we've decided yet whether we still want that. I just know we all want this thing called life to be easier, and Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be getting that way anytime soon. So it's up to us to do something about it. Emotional intelligence so you don't move emotionally.
Sweet little ditty, I don't mean to hurt you, baby.